The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't my alarm blaring in my ears or the desperate need for coffee, it was the gut-wrenching realization that I was already late. I shot up from bed, my heart pounding, throwing on the first clothes I could grab. My phone screen glowed mockingly with 3 missed calls from my boss. Fantastic. I shoved my feet into my sneakers, grabbed my bag, practically inhaled a piece of toast, and bolted out the door, mentally preparing to break every speed limit necessary to make it to work before my boss had a coronary. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. A massive, shiny SUV was parked directly across the entrance of my driveway, blocking me in like a steel wall of pure frustration. I blinked, hoping for a second that I was hallucinating. Nope. It was real, and very much in my way. My pulse pounded in my temples as I rushed toward it, scanning for any sign of its owner. Nothing. No apologetic note. No neighbor standing sheepishly nearby. Just an immovable, oversized obstacle sitting between me and what little hope I had left of keeping my job. I honked once. Twice. 3 times. The SUV remained as still and unmoved as my growing rage. I ran to the nearest houses, knocking frantically. Still nothing. The minutes ticked by, my patience wearing thinner than the soles of my overused sneakers. Then it hit me. I knew whose car this was. I just didn't want to believe it. Karen. She had moved into the neighborhood a few months ago and somehow managed to irritate every single person within a 3-block radius. The queen of unsolicited complaints, passive-aggressive notes, and the loudest, most grating voice I'd ever heard. She had reported kids for riding their bikes too fast on the sidewalk, complained about wind chimes being too loud, and once called animal control because a neighbor's cat looked suspicious. She was a walking, talking HOA violation waiting to happen. I stormed up to her door and banged on it like I was the police. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, revealing Karen in silk pajamas, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, looking entirely unbothered. She arched an eyebrow, taking a slow sip. "Can I help you?" she asked, tilting her head like I was a door-to-door salesman instead of a man being held hostage in his own driveway. I clenched my jaw. "Your car is blocking my driveway. I need to get to work." Karen smacked her lips together, letting out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, that. Yeah, I had some heavy groceries last night and didn't feel like carrying them too far, so I just parked there." I blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of it. "Okay. But can you move it now?" She sighed again, this time dramatically, as if I'd asked her to lift the SUV with sheer willpower. "I mean, I could, but I literally just sat down with my coffee." "Can't you wait?" "No. I absolutely could not wait. I was already late, and I was done playing nice." "Karen, move the car." She frowned like I had personally offended her. "You know, you could be a little more understanding. A good neighbor wouldn't be so aggressive about something so small." Small. She was calling this small. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. "Just move the car." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Fine. But you really need to work on your attitude." I watched, seething, as she took her sweet time, leisurely finishing her coffee, putting on slippers, and stretching like she had all the time in the world. 10 agonizing minutes later, she finally shuffled outside, moved the SUV just enough for me to squeeze out of my driveway, and waved me off like she was doing me a favor. I floored it, cursing under my breath the entire way to work. 30 minutes late. An earful from my boss. A ruined morning. And yet, somehow, I convinced myself to let it go. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe she'd realize how inconsiderate she was and never do it again. I was wrong. The next morning, I stepped outside, already dreading the day ahead, only to stop dead in my tracks. My driveway was blocked. Again. This time, Karen's SUV wasn't just casually parked in the way, it was angled even worse, like she had deliberately positioned it to be as obstructive as possible. I felt the heat rise in my chest, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. I had given her the benefit of the doubt. I had assumed she'd at least try to be a decent human being after the stunt she pulled yesterday. But this? This was intentional. I didn't bother knocking on her door this time. I went straight for my phone and called the tow truck. 15 minutes later, a bulky man in a neon vest stepped out of his truck, whistling low as he took in the situation. "Wow," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's a bold place to park." "Yeah," I said, tight-lipped. "She thinks she owns the street." The tow truck driver didn't waste any time. The moment the hook latched onto Karen's SUV, the universe seemed to sense the impending chaos, because right on cue, her front door burst open. Karen came storming out of her house in full fury mode, her pink robe billowing behind her like some sort of deranged supervillain cape. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she screeched, her face contorted in rage. "Having your car towed," I said flatly, arms crossed. "You can't do that." "Actually," I said, watching as her SUV lifted off the ground, "I can." She gasped like I had just personally struck her down with lightning. "You absolute jerk. I was going to move it." "When? Next week?" She stomped her foot so hard I thought she might crack the pavement. "You don't understand what you've just done. I have an important appointment today. You've ruined everything." I shrugged. "Guess you should have thought of that before treating my driveway like your personal parking spot." The tow truck driver tipped his cap. "She can pick it up at the impound lot." Karen let out a guttural scream as her precious SUV disappeared down the street. For the rest of the day, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. I should have known better. That night, as I pulled into my driveway, my stomach dropped. My entire front yard was covered in toilet paper. White streamers hung from the trees, wrapped around my porch, even strung across my car. A bag of garbage had been dumped on my doorstep, its contents spilling onto the welcome mat. And the cherry on top? A note taped to my door, written in messy, furious handwriting. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." I stared at the mess, jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. My first instinct was to march right over to her house and pound on her door until she admitted to it. But that's exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to react, to stoop to her level. So instead, I spent the next hour cleaning up, tossing the garbage back into a bin, ripping the toilet paper from my trees, all while muttering every curse word I knew under my breath. I told myself that was it. She got her tantrum out of her system. It would end here. But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, as I stepped outside, the world felt strangely quiet. No notifications on my phone, no morning news playing from my neighbor's porch. Something felt off. That's when I noticed it. The cable running along the side of my house was ripped out. Not unplugged. Ripped. I followed the severed line, my stomach churning, and when I saw where it led, my blood boiled. The cable had been tossed onto Karen's lawn like a trophy. I stormed over to her door, knocking so hard I was half convinced it would fall off its hinges. After an infuriatingly long pause, Karen finally opened it, wearing a smirk so smug it should have been illegal. "Good morning, neighbor," she chirped, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. I held up the torn cable. "What the hell did you do to my internet?" She gasped, placing a hand over her chest like I had accused her of a heinous crime. "Oh my. Did something happen?" I exhaled sharply. "Karen. I know you did this." She sighed dramatically, leaning against her doorframe. "Well, I did notice your Wi-Fi was interfering with my signal." My shows kept buffering, and I simply cannot tolerate that. I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of what she was saying. So your solution was to, what? Sabotage my connection? She shrugged, flipping her hair over her shoulder. I was just making things fair. Maybe you should learn to be a more considerate neighbor. I was torn between laughter and pure rage. She had trashed my yard, cut my internet, and was now acting like I was the problem. You covered my lawn in garbage last night, Karen. She smiled. Prove it. And that was when I realized, this wasn't just some petty neighborhood dispute anymore. This was war. The next few days were a battlefield. Karen wasn't just content with cutting my internet or trashing my yard, she had escalated her nonsense into a full-scale campaign of harassment. It started with noise complaints. Suddenly, I was receiving warnings from the city about excessively loud music, despite the fact that I hadn't even been home during the reported times. Then came the mystery complaints to the HOA. Supposedly, my grass was too long, my trash bins weren't placed at the curb correctly, and my porch light was too bright at night. Every day, it was something new, something more absurd. But the final straw came when animal control showed up at my door. I opened it one afternoon to find a uniformed officer standing on my porch, clipboard in hand. Sir, we received a complaint about a dangerous, out-of-control dog at this residence. I blinked at him, confused. I don't have a dog. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. Yeah, that's what I figured. We've had a few calls about an aggressive animal here, but there's no record of you owning a pet. A slow, cold anger crept into my chest. Karen. The officer gave me a tired look. She called 3 times. Claimed you had an unlicensed, dangerous breed running loose. I pinched the bridge of my nose, inhaling sharply. So what now? Nothing. I'm closing the complaint. Just wanted to let you know what's been going on. That was it. I had reached my limit. Karen had spent the last week making my life miserable, throwing tantrums because she couldn't handle the consequences of her own actions. It was time to return the favor. That night, I stayed up doing research, combing through every city ordinance, every parking regulation, every legal loophole I could find. And then I found it, the perfect revenge. Karen hadn't picked up her SUV from the impound lot. And according to the law, if a vehicle remains unclaimed past a certain deadline, it can be auctioned off to cover impound fees. My heart pounded as I checked the impound lot's website. There it was, Karen's SUV, still sitting there. And the deadline? Tomorrow morning. I didn't hesitate. The next morning, I drove straight to the impound lot, walked up to the counter, and paid the outstanding fees. The process was shockingly easy. A few signatures, a payment, and just like that, the SUV was mine. Karen didn't know it yet. But she was about to find out. That afternoon, I made sure to be outside when she finally realized her car was gone. It started with her usual clicking heels down the driveway, then a sudden stop. Silence. Then, a horrified, strangled scream. Where's my car? I stepped off my porch, pretending to look concerned. Still at the impound lot? She spun toward me, eyes blazing. Obviously not. I went there this morning, and they told me it was gone. I crossed my arms, watching the realization dawn in her face. Oh, right. Yeah. It's not there anymore. It's mine now. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely speechless. What do you mean, not mine? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the receipt, unfolding it painfully slow for dramatic effect. Turns out, when you don't claim a towed vehicle in time, it becomes available for auction. And I just so happened to cover the fees. The color drained from her face. You can't do that. Oh, but I did. The scream she let out was almost supernatural. "You have no idea what you've just done." She lunged for the paper in my hand, but I yanked it back, enjoying every second of her meltdown. Karen's mind was racing. I could see it. Then suddenly, her eyes lit up. A desperate idea took shape. She straightened, forcing a smug smirk onto her face. "Fine. I'll just buy it back at auction." I grinned. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of stopping you." I checked my phone, then shrugged. "Only problem is, the auction already happened this morning." Her confidence cracked. No, that's impossible." I gave her a sympathetic head tilt. "It was a great deal, too. Sold for way below market price. Some guy named Dave picked it up." Karen staggered back like I had physically hit her. Her hands trembled at her sides. "You're lying." I nodded toward the street. "Guess you'll just have to go check for yourself." For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in absolute devastation. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard I heard something fall inside. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since this insane battle started, I felt like I had won. But something told me Karen wasn't done yet. The eerie silence that followed Karen's meltdown should have felt like a victory. But instead, it made me uneasy. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't dealing with her screaming, her smug comments, or her absurd complaints. It was quiet, too quiet. And if there was one thing I had learned about Karen, it was that she never accepted defeat. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept circling back to her expression when she realized her SUV was gone. That kind of rage didn't just vanish overnight. She was planning something. And I didn't have to wait long to find out what. The next morning, I was woken up by an aggressive pounding on my front door. The kind that makes your stomach drop because it's never a good sign. I rolled out of bed, groggy and annoyed, only to open the door and find 2 police officers standing on my porch. Behind them stood Karen, arms crossed, eyes glinting with vicious satisfaction. One of the officers, a tall man with a serious expression, cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report that you illegally took possession of this woman's vehicle." Karen stepped forward dramatically, voice quivering as she pointed at me. "He stole my car. He tricked the impound lot into selling it before I could retrieve it. This is fraud, he needs to be arrested." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "Officers, I have all the paperwork proving that I legally obtained the vehicle after it was left unclaimed." Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. He probably faked it." Ignoring her, I stepped inside, grabbed the neatly organized folder I had put together the moment I anticipated she'd try something like this, and handed it to the officer. He flipped through the pages carefully while Karen craned her neck, trying to see. The longer he read, the more her confidence started to crack. After a moment, the officer looked up at his partner and nodded. "Everything appears to be in order." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Wait, no, you don't understand. He did this on purpose. He wanted to ruin my life." The second officer, clearly losing patience, turned to her. "Ma'am, from what we can see, this was a legal transaction. You had ample time to retrieve your vehicle before it was processed for auction." Karen's face flushed an alarming shade of red. But, he manipulated the situation. He should have told me." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the way you told me when you blocked my driveway twice?" The officers exchanged looks, clearly realizing this was a ridiculous neighbor dispute. One of them sighed. "Ma'am, unless you have concrete proof of criminal activity, there's nothing we can do." Karen clenched her fists so tightly I thought her nails might draw blood. "You have to do something. He can't get away with this." The officer exhaled heavily. "Ma'am, you're lucky you're not the one in trouble for filing a false police report. We suggest you let this go." Karen let out an inhuman screech as the officers turned to leave. She glared at me with pure hatred, seething with unfiltered rage. "This isn't over," she hissed, voice shaking. I shrugged. "Kind of feels like it is." She spun on her heel, storming back inside, slamming her door so hard that I heard something crash inside her house. For the first time in weeks, I finally thought this would be the end of it. But I should have known, Karen wasn't just angry. She was humiliated. And humiliated people do desperate things. That night, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line made my stomach drop. "See you in court." I clicked on it, my eyes narrowing as I read through the absolute insanity that followed. It was a long, unhinged rant about how she was suing me for theft, emotional distress, and damages. Attached was a ridiculously amateur lawsuit document, probably pulled from some sketchy website, written in Comic Sans. I laughed out loud. She was actually going through with this. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of legal threats. She actually tried to file a lawsuit, but it was so absurd that no lawyer would take her case. That didn't stop her from spreading rumors around the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that I was a scam artist and a criminal. A few gullible neighbors believed her, but most saw through her nonsense. And then, in the ultimate twist of karma, Karen's own past caught up with her. Her wannabe lawyer did some digging into her records and discovered something very interesting. Karen had numerous unpaid HOA violations. Apparently, she had been dodging fees and breaking neighborhood policies for months. She also had outstanding fines from other disputes in different neighborhoods she had lived in before. Turns out, this wasn't her first rodeo. Word got around fast. The HOA, sick of her nonsense, hit her with massive fines. And then came the real kicker. Karen had been so obsessed with making my life miserable that she had completely ignored her property tax payments. The city came knocking. Suddenly, she wasn't just at war with me. She was fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts. And it was glorious to watch. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the peaceful silence that had finally returned to the neighborhood, when I noticed something unusual: a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house. I stood up, watching as she frantically directed movers, her face twisted in pure frustration and humiliation. It was happening. Karen was leaving. I didn't even have to ask what had gone wrong. The signs were everywhere. After weeks of fighting me, the HOA, and the city itself, she had finally backed herself into a corner. The unpaid violations, mounting fines, and property tax issues had snowballed into a financial disaster, and now, she was out of options. She had spent so much time trying to make my life hell that she had completely ignored the fact that she was destroying her own. I walked over, taking a slow sip of my coffee, watching her struggle to keep what little dignity she had left. "Going somewhere?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice neutral. She shot me a glare so sharp I was surprised it didn't cut the air. "Don't talk to me." I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be concerned. "Oh, but I thought you loved this neighborhood. You made such a big deal about it." She clenched her jaw so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. "This isn't because of you," she snapped. I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Right. Totally unrelated." She turned away, barking angry orders at the movers, but I could see the humiliation in her posture. She had lost. Completely. The final cherry on top. The rental car she drove away in. Her beloved SUV, the one that had started this entire war, was now owned by a guy named Dave, who was using it for his landscaping business. As Karen threw open the car door and climbed inside, she turned back one last time, her face twisted in hatred. I gave her a friendly wave. Drive safe, Karen. She flipped me off through the window before speeding away, tires screeching, as if she could somehow outrun the mess she had created for herself. And just like that, peace returned to the neighborhood. No more blocked driveways. No more screaming matches. No more ridiculous antics. A few weeks later, a new family moved into Karen's old house. They were polite, quiet, and most importantly, not insane. I introduced myself, and within minutes, I could tell they were nothing like their predecessor. One evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the street, I couldn't help but smile. The battle had been long, ridiculous, and exhausting, but in the end, karma had done its job. And I had won. But as I thought about the chaos Karen had put me through, I couldn't help but wonder, how many people have had to deal with a Karen just like her? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or a nightmare neighbor? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.